Okay, perfect. We are live. I hope everyone is doing well. We are on our, what is this, our fifth reading now of Lacan's seminar on the Purloined Letter. I would say that we're doing a pretty thorough analysis here, going kind of sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. Last week, or our last discussion, we discussed a little bit about the kind of etymology of the word purloined. That's kind of where we ended. We discussed a few things. I mean, Lacan goes in on some of Baudelaire's translation. We talk a lot about, I mean, a lot of it, in my opinion, gets a little repetitive with just like the exchanging of letters, the theft of the letters, the acquiring of it, a lot about how language is fluid, so on and so forth. So now we're going to kind of pick up after this little etymology that he goes that he discusses. So if with that being said, I think we're good and we can continue. Is everyone cool with that? Okay, let's do it. Thus, we are confirmed in our detour by the very object which draws us on into it, for we are quite simply dealing with a letter which has been diverted from its path, one whose course has been prolonged, etymologically the word of the title, or, to revert to the language of the post office, a letter in sufferance. So he's using a bit of like a weird, postal terminology here. I guess the word sufferance simply just means to divert something from its intended path or its intended destination in a way. So if it's not obvious by now, what he's kind of getting at is that the letter, it's not simply just something easily stolen. It's just something that has been rerouted in a way, which is why, I think for him it makes more sense to not say that it's stolen, but to say, it's purloined. And that's maybe the issue with the translation for him in French. It's that it just translates as stolen. Does anyone think about the word sufferance here? Maybe like why he's relating it to postal terminology? Any kind of comments there? I mean, I feel like it's a pretty straightforward section. Okay, then. Here then, simple and odd, as we are told on the very first page, reduced to its simplest expression, is the singularity of the letter, which as the title indicates, is the true subject of the tale. Since it can be diverted, it must have a course which is proper to it, the trait by which its incidence as signifier is affirmed. For we have learned to conceive of the signifier as sustaining itself only in a displacement comparable to what is to that found in electric news strips or in the rotating memories of our machines that think like men. This because of the alternating operation which is its principle, requiring it to leave its place, even though it returns to it by a circular path. Okay, so he's definitely expanding on everything that we said previously, that it's a question of the letter being diverted from its path. What I wrote here in my notes is that Lacan is writing about this letter being both simple and odd because the simplicity of the story is just about a scrap of paper. It's about a letter that we don't even know the contents of. Yet it's odd in the same vein because of the immense power that this scrap of paper holds. So the true subject of the story is not going to be the queen or the king or Dupin or any of the other characters. The true subject is that of the letter, and specifically with the letter having a particular path that it's meant to follow, and that it has been diverted. I think that the big kind of sentence here, and anyone can kind of correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the trait by which its incidence as signifier is affirmed. So this is going to be getting, this is going to be getting really into the kind of purpose or the structure of repetition automatism and how signifiers are part of that symbolic chain and how they are always en route However, as we see through this story, some signifiers get diverted from their path, and it causes this repetition automatism or these repetitive, cyclical events in a way. And that could manifest in behaviors or intrusive thoughts or something along those lines for individuals or for subjects. So I don't know. I find that sentence to be interesting because it's not until this letter is pushed away from its course that it's affirmed as a signifier. I mean, I find that interesting. I don't know if anyone else takes something away from that, but it's almost as if, the only meaning that we get from this, or the only, the true signification of this letter that we don't know the content of, solely resides in the fact that it's pushed off course. Um, I just noticed Shakespeare in the chat wrote, "Well, sufferance can mean either that it holds no objections to anything, but also that it can be suffering in the present progressive sense." Interesting. So in the first, there's no objections. In a way, I mean, if I can add like a little bit of like personal analysis or whatever, when we say no objections, um, the content of the letter can't really be spilled out. So the queen isn't able to object in any kind of way. There's no formal objection to the fact that the letter is stolen. And then in the other way of suffering in a present progressive tense, meaning that it's ongoing. That's kind of interesting too, because there is a kind of suffering on behalf of the queen, or really whoever holds the letter. Towards the end of this piece, Lacan is going to spend a lot of time about why whoever holds the letter is like immensely affected by it, and it changes their subjectivity, or it constitutes their subjectivity. And because the letter is always being stolen and acquired, it's always changing subjectivity as well. And in a way, there's a lot of suffering going on too. So that's kind of a good catch here that you noted. I don't know, the fact that the letter being diverted from its course is one of suffering. Okay. And then towards like the end of this kind of paragraph, we have a few things. Lacan writes that we have learned to conceive of the signifier as sustaining itself only in a displacement, meaning that when this sign, this letter is displaced, um, it's diverted from its course, we see that it being a pure signifier, can exist. So it's kind of just a repeated, it's kind of what we just said before. I do like this analogy to electric news strips, though. So think of like the Star Wars opening uh, crawl with all of the text where the words are moving up and then they're disappearing. Um, I think that's kind of interesting that he's using that as a way to kind of talk about the path of where the letter is going. It's kind of, he also says here, rotating memories. Um, I think of the mind is what he's trying to get at. So it's almost like, or machines, sorry, like machines that it appears as though they have a mind, like maybe like early machines having data that goes in a circular manner. So all of the data is eventually going to come back to its original position. So I guess maybe it's like imagine you have the Star Wars opening crawl, and then at the end, it repeats over and over and over again. So even though some of the words are disappearing out into this void, it's eventually going to come back. And that's sort of what he's describing this letter is in the story. It's that it kind of goes away, it goes through all of these hands, then it eventually goes back to its intended kind of place. I mean, that's the best example that I could kind of come up with. Does anyone have anything to say here? And interesting, Shakespeare wrote another comment, as in a literal circuit being circular. And I'm assuming you're talking maybe about like the electric like the news strips or the machines, how these things are always coming back. Oh, okay, yes, perfect. As a literal circuit. And that's very interesting that you're looking at it that way because that's really the symbolic chain. It's a circuit. where these everything is kind of every sign is going on its own kind of path or journey. They're all interconnected with one another, and where the pure signifier is within that, how that is being displaced, that is what is the cause of repetition automatism. So if we continue with this next paragraph, we will see pretty much what was just said. This is indeed what happens in the repetition automatism. What Freud teaches us in the text we are commenting on is that the subject must pass through the channels of the symbolic. But what is illustrated here is more gripping still. It is not only the subject, but the subjects grasped in their intersubjectivity who line up, in other words, are ostriches, to whom we here return, and who, more docile than sheep, model their very being on the moment of the signifying chain which traverses them. I really do like um, this paragraph here because it's really reaffirming and restating a lot of what was said earlier, but being kind of clear on what Lacan is saying. And if it's not evident by now, he kind of rarely is this upfront, I feel. I just personally find this paragraph to be more upfront than usual. So clearly he gives us that little thesis that this is repetition automatism. It's where we have this data being stored up, going out, and eventually returning to its intended destination. But then he comments a lot on Freud here. So he's he's showing us that the subject is really mediated or constituted by or passing through the symbolic, which means that a subject cannot exist outside of or separate from or divorced from signs and significations. I mean, it's very obvious that that's what he's saying. Um, Rather, the subject is passing through them, and it's this continual passage. So it's almost as if the subject has not a destination, but a path as well, right? It's that the subject has this innate path that they're leading to. Um, but but what's interesting here is that normally in psychoanalysis, when we think about the subject, we're thinking about like an individual patient, which makes sense. But here he's saying very clearly, quote, grasped in their intersubjectivity. Grasp in their intersubjectivity, which is really specific to when he first talks about an intersubjective modulus, or how each character or each subject exists um, in relation to each other. So in the Purloined Letter, you can't have the queen without the king. You can't have the king without the minister without Dupont. You can't have without the narrator. So all of these, um, it's an interconnected type of subject in a way. And I don't know. I find that interesting because this is showing a little bit of how I think, at least in my opinion, how Lacan is also departing from Freud, and we can very much see how Deleuze and Guattari are building a lot on this in a way. A lot of this, not viewing the subject solely as this individual thing, disconnected, from everything else. So I don't know. I think that this is kind of an interesting thing here. Um, does anyone remember the discussion about ostriches from earlier? I think it was from reading like 2 or 3. So remember with ostriches, um, it's in again in French and maybe homomorphism. You can help me here. Ostrich is atruque or something like that. A truc or something. I forget the exact French, but ostrich looks very similar to the word other in French, which is like autre.
Um, it's autruche.
Okay, so I just butchered it. Sorry, ostrich. Yes, that's ostrich.
Yep, and then other is autre.
Ostrich. Okay, okay. They sound very similar, and like I guess the way that they're spelt is pretty similar too. Um, my French is terrible. But what's important here is when we refer to ostriches from before, um, in the piece, he's talking about how, and he uses that kind of example, potentially, a myth or whatever, of when ostriches get scared, they put their head in the sand, and they can't, they don't see anything. And it's interesting that he kind of compares this to characters in the story where, they're kind of blind to what's out in the open or what's right in front of them. Their heads are stuck in the sand. Um, and while their heads are stuck in while their heads are stuck in the sand, the other is always still there, present, right? You can't escape it, right? For Lacan here, because this piece is heavily about the symbolic order. So when he says the subjects, um, who line up like ostriches, um, who are also more docile than sheep, he's being very clever with the use of the other here, and how these subjects, when they're more docile than sheep, more docile than what we usually call docile, that means that these subjects are very much conforming and being uh, they're conforming to where they are in that signifying chain. So there are these very strict roles. The king stays the king, the queen stays the queen, the minister stays the minister. They're very strict in their roles, um, in the position that they occupy within the signifying chain. So it's kind of like a big, I don't know, I feel like this paragraph is a big like TLDR of a lot of the story, or a lot of Lacan's analysis at least. If everyone's good there, we can continue. Oh, okay, August. Perfect. Let's see what you wrote. I Googled the ostrich head in the sand thing, and it's a myth so old it comes from ancient Rome. Amazing. And it's interesting, I believe in our last reading or the one before, Lacan also mentions some ancient Rome like philosophers, I think, in this. Um, from what I remember, I think, what is it, Cicero or something? Okay, pretty cool though. And then Shakespeare replies with, I remember in South Africa in the Great Karoo, you can actually go ostrich racing. That is insane. I think there was this restaurant. I don't know if it's like open or anything, but at least I think it was on the West Coast, called Fuddruckers, and they were known for like really crazy, um, I don't know, like meats. And I think that you could like have an ostrich burger. I think you could, which is kind of interesting. Um, yeah, not going to speak on the ethicality of that or anything, but I just thought it'd be interesting to note because we're talking about ostriches. Okay, let's do it. If what Freud discovered and rediscovers with a perpetually increasing sense of shock has a meaning, it is that the displacement of the signifier determines the subjects in their acts, in their destiny, in their refusals, in their blindness, in their end, and in their fate, their innate gifts and social acquisitions notwithstanding, without regard for character or sex, and that willingly or not, everything that might be considered the stuff of psychology, kit and caboodle, will follow the path of the signifier. So this is a lot. He's giving like many kind of examples about why the displacement of the signifier is profound. We don't need to go through all of them, but essentially Lacan is just saying that, Freud was shocked. I mean, he says increasing sense of shock. Like Freud was shocked by how much the unconscious, or how much influence the unconscious has, and how Lacan is really stating that the displacement of the signifier is so profound that everything is shaped. Everything in the subject's life is shaped from it. Everything from your desires and aspirations to, death, everything is determined by this displacement. So, regardless of any inherent traits a subject thinks they might have or do have, it's, the ultimate actions and behaviors and thoughts they have are determined by the displacement of the signifier. Where the pure signifier lies in the signifying chain. Yeah, and I don't know, I like everything that might be considered the stuff of psychology, kit and caboodle. So it's just like all of the tiny aspects of psychology, everything is going to be predicated from this displacement of the signifier, regardless, like what he's saying, regardless of character or sex, regardless of anything, it all just comes down to the displacement of the signifier determining the subject. Okay. And feel free to just jump in if you have any kind of comment or anything, even if it's like, that's cool, feel free. Or just put this on as background noise or just listen in. Doesn't matter. Let's continue. Here we are, in fact, yet again at the crossroads at which we had left our drama in its round with the question of the way in which the subjects replace each other in it. Our fable is so constructed as to show that it is the letter and its diversion which governs their entries and roles. If it be in sufferance, they shall endure the pain. Should they pass beneath its shadow, they become its reflection. Falling in possession of the letter, admirable ambiguity of language, its meaning possesses them. Okay, so a little bit's going on here, but we kind of overall just discussed this. I think what really what really stands out to me is essentially the holder of the letter. Let's just start there. The holder of the letter um, be, means that that individual or that subject exists beneath that letter's shadow. Um, the letter is so powerful in this story that those who, you know, pass beneath this shadow, I think it can be interpreted in two ways. So the first I think is like if you do hold a letter, you are in its shadow. It has power over you. And the second is just like those who pass by it in the story in a way um, have a role in the theft and concealment of the letter. I mean, the way I think about it is the queen puts the letter on the table, minister sees it, he's passing beneath the letter shadow, he takes it, and then the letter has power over him through which Dupont takes it. So I don't know, I mean the way that I think about it is that the letter is just so immensely powerful that those who have it are, in a way, it says, quote, they endure pain. Does anyone have an idea of like why in the story Lacan is saying people would, or a subject would endure pain here? If the letter is in sufferance, they shall endure the pain. So that means that whoever occupies the letter, who shouldn't have it, so essentially if whoever has it other than the queen, they have pain.
I think it's worth noting, it says, should they pass beneath its shadow, they become its reflection. I don't think that's just talking about who currently is possessing the letter also. It's talking about how they are sort of forever within the context of the story until the letter gets resolved. Part of the signifying chain maybe of or part of the displacement that the letter represents. Like even once was it the count that stole it? I can't remember.
Like we have
The
the minister, the
the
prefect of police
minister.
tries to
Well,
find it. Yeah.
even once the minister stole it, even once it gets stolen back, he's still under its shadow. He's still wrapped up in the intrigue and in all of the issues with possessing the letter, even though he doesn't possess it anymore, just by possessing it at some point.
Ooh, I really like your interpretation here. I think you're on the money here too, because you're very right. I mean, even when Dupont takes the letter from the minister, it's not like, the minister's importance diminishes in a way, right? I mean, that's still integral to the story. So maybe, the minister taking the letter, even though they got the letter stolen from them, they're still impacted by the letter. and the
Yeah,
fact that
there's
they
still
took it.
its reflection.
Well, and in a way, then, August, if you think about it, Dupin leaves a decoy letter too. So it's like it's very much like the minister still goes about his day thinking that he has the letter, right? Because like it's like a decoy that's there. So he's still, even though he
Oh,
doesn't
true.
physically have it, you know, like he's still acting as if he does. So it's kind of a great. I'm really happy that you brought that up because for me, I guess I was only looking at it from the perspective of like whoever actually physically holds the letter, like they're impacted. But no, this is you're very right. This is very much that whoever kind of the subjects passing beneath the shadow are becoming this letter's reflection. Like that's a very good way of putting it. And when we tie this to maybe to repetition automatism writ large, I mean, we see that when people pass through the letter of the shadow, there's going to be some theft and some concealment of the letter. In the same way that when the subject maybe passes beneath pure signifiers, within, I don't want to say like their symbolic chain, but Lacan does get up and say that, we all have our own purloined letters, and that's going to be towards the end. So I'll just to simplify it, it's like you and your purloined letters, when you pass beneath its shadow, you become its reflection, and that's what causes these repetitive behaviors. In the same way that the minister passes, beneath its shadow, and they now become that theft and concealment. They act in a different way now, and and the story continues. But yeah, very very good here. If everyone's good with that, let's do it. So we are shown by the hero of the drama and the repetition of the very situation which his daring brought to a head a first time to his triumph. If he now succumbs to it, it is because he has shifted to the second position in the triad in which he was initially a third, as well as the thief, and this by virtue of the object of his theft. So here we have this idea, second position in the triad. So this has already played a little bit of a big role here because of where the characters are sort of lined up. So we clearly know at the beginning here, we are shown the hero of the drama. Clearly this is Dupin, right? He succeeded in how he approached the situation. He found the letter, and there was some kind of sense of triumph where, Dupin looks super legit when he pulls out the letter and he's like, boom, now give me my money, right? So clearly Dupin was aware of this symbolic dimension. However, when Lacan says if Dupin succumbs to it, he now has shifted to the second position in the triad. So when we look at this triadic structure in the story, I mean, the way that I'm thinking about it, it might be the queen, right? Like that position. It may be the prefect and Dupin, right? That could be it. And that in order, 1, 2, 3. Now, Dupin would be shifting to a second position now because now he has the letter. Or it might be the queen, the minister, Dupin as well, depending on how you interpret the triadic structure. Regardless, when Dupin shifts into this position, he's no longer third divorced from what's happening. He's playing a very essential, an integral role to the where the letter is. So essentially, Dupin becomes entangled in this mess, in this repetitive mess that he once kind of was criticizing. What I kind of was questioning though, because Lacan is introducing this triadic structure a little bit here. I wonder if the reader themselves is here at all, because I mean on first read Lacan is kind of saying like if you read this surface level, you take away a very different interpretation than if you read it through kind of a psychoanalytic lens, right? So I wonder if where the reader exists in this triad in a way. I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but I don't know. I thought maybe something could do with
Has
the
he
reader here.
explained the triad much? Maybe
Well,
it'll be easier to tell when he gets more into the triad.
he mentions it a few times. Yeah, but it looks like the times he mentions it is um further above or further below of where we're at. So we'll get there. So maybe I'm jumping a little ahead. Um, but the main thing is here though with this triad is essentially just how close are you to the theft and concealment of the letter? You know, are you the person that it got stolen from? Are you the person occupying it? Or are you that third person on the outside looking in? Now, when Dupin is able to steal the letter, he now switches place with the minister. He's the one that has the letter, and the minister is on the outside, or the prefect is on the outside. So I don't know. It's just kind of something to think about. But maybe I'm jumping ahead. Um, Shakespeare, I noticed you're typing. Let's read this here. So Shakespeare writes, I do find it interesting that the word inquisitive is being used, considering it can also refer to the idea of the Inquisition and how it upheld the triadic structure, which then has to be hidden, like crypto Jews have to from being discovered alongside with the idea of being captivated. There's a lot going on in your comment, and I appreciate it. I do also wonder if it refers to some type of uh, historical moment. I mean, what Lacan is doing here, I mean, throughout this, he's putting in a lot of different like he mentions different uh, authors, histories, so on and so forth. He kind of gives examples of like ancient like Roman history and stuff. So it's very well could be a mention to the triadic structure there. I'm not personally like super familiar with it myself, but okay, I'll definitely add that to my notes and look into it. And welcome, Jack. Good to see you. All right.
Good to be seen.
Okay, let's do it. For if it is, now as before, a question of protecting the letter from inquisitive eyes. So right here, yeah, inquisitive eyes. He can do nothing but employ the same technique he himself has already foiled. Leave it in the open? And we may properly doubt that he knows what he is thus doing when we see him immediately captivated by a dual relationship in which we find all the traits of a mimetic lure or of an animal feigning death, and trapped in the typically imaginary situation of seeing that he is not seen, misconstrue the real situation in which he is seen not seeing. And what does he fail to see? Precisely the symbolic situation which he himself was so well able to see, and in which he is now seeing himself not being seen. Okay, so there's a little going on here. I think for me, because he mentions the hero of the drama right before this, I think it's Dupin. But then part of me feels that there are aspects of this maybe being that of the minister. So I wanted to say that first. So maybe the question as we're approaching this paragraph is, who is it about? So that question of inquisitive eyes, I'm glad you kind of left that comment there, Shakespeare. I'll definitely want to look into the Inquisition itself. But we have seen throughout the story that if one were able to hold the letter and want to, make it hidden, Lacan kind of asks, should you just leave it out in the open? But the thing is, it seems that he's criticizing this because he says that it's already foiled. Right? This like plan has already foiled. So it seems like he's criticizing this approach. I don't think he's saying that it's a bad hiding spot, but more along the lines of maybe people don't understand the symbolic dimension to this act here. So that's why he says we may properly doubt that he knows what he is doing. So if someone leaves a letter out in the open, maybe, they're not really understanding what they're doing because they're caught in this quote unquote dual relationship. So I think he uses this example of an animal feigning death. So that's when an animal, or the mimetic lure as well. So when he says that there's an animal feigning death, it's very clear that an animal might pretend to be dead in order, to avoid being eaten or attacked or whatnot. However, contradictory in a way that makes the animal more vulnerable. So maybe with Dupin trying to appear maybe unaware, bit vulnerable, he tries to be outside of it. I think that's why Lacan said he's in that third position in the triadic structure, or in the triad. So he tries to kind of remain on the outside. However, even though he's trying to play like, oh, I don't really have any stake in the game, the fact that he goes and takes the letter proves that he is very much trapped in this quote unquote imaginary situation where Dupin kind of thinks that he's not being observed, but Lacan, it seems to me at least, maybe he is being observed. I don't know like how Dupin is being observed necessarily. Maybe the reader is watching him. It could be kind of an interesting take, or maybe the fact that he gives the letter to the prefect, it just kind of goes full circle that like he's very much seen now. So that's kind of the main thing I took here. Anyone else?
I think it's circle is the convenient term, right? It's the triangle because it's a triad, right? So like what I'm getting out of this is it's less whether or not I don't know that it's a criticism. I think it's more like an observation that it's not a conscious decision on anyone's part, right? So whether or not Dupont has a motive, right? For instance, whether or not he thinks he can make money, he's not consciously participating in the symbolic, right? The symbolic is given a structure that Dupont finds himself, well, will find himself unwittingly participating in, right? In that sense, he takes a place in the triangle, or rather, he takes a new place in the triangle, because in a way, he's already in the triangle, right? Similar to the minister in the beginning. The minister comes into knowledge of information. The minister, with that information, takes the letter, right? Same move as Dupont. I think to your point, though, Noah, I think Lacan does offer us this much. You don't have to do the symbolic here. You could actually do something else. It's because he doesn't that this continues, right? And I think the reason Lacan gives for that is, so right, like this is not a conscious thing, right? We're not working off of um, like the ego specifically here. I think what he's saying is that what happens to people here is the imaginary gives them a sense of not being seen, the way that an animal playing dead thinks it's not being seen. But in closing its eyes, so to speak, to not being seen, it misses that it's being seen by the symbolic. So the relationship between the imaginary and the symbolic, right? The imaginary is actually kind of insulating the people in the story from their participation in the triad symbolically. But it's not just insulating them from it, it's insulating from them from kind of seeing it, say, like a conscious level, but more poignantly, it keeps them as people in it, right? Because Lacan's point is this is impersonal. People aren't necessarily at a personal level wanting to do this. They are moving through it impersonally. And the symbolic and imaginary keep them doing that, right? Anybody can do it is his point. Dupin comes into the triad. The minister, in a sense, exits the triad. Well, maybe the queen exits the triad. It kind of depends how we want to open that up. But you move in and out of the triangle in a sense, or around it.
I think that's perfect. I think that's a fantastic explanation. And yeah, I see what you're saying. It's almost like I mean, I think we noted before that that something along the lines of how the subject is always passing through the symbolic. And in a way, I think what Lacan is getting at, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that, Dupin is maybe trying to come off as if he's not affected, right? Or that he's not part of it. But in doing so, it makes him even more vulnerable to the effects of the letter or of the situation that he's now in.
Yeah, I would even go almost take a step back from that and say, like, whether or not he thinks he's in or outside of it, right? Um, that's an imaginary move, right? So it's that part you have highlighted. Trapped in the typically imaginary situation of seeing that he is not seen, so as to misconstrue the real situation in which he is seen, not seen, which is just a really jumbly way of saying that in the imaginary, on one hand, you 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 see that you're not seen, but that's a misconstrue in which you are actually seen, not seen.
Yeah, it's
So
it's like
yeah, it's the
it's like
converse, right?
like with the eyes closed, like what you said. Like if I have my eyes closed, I can say like, oh, like I'm not being seen, But from someone on the outside, it's like, no, you are being seen, but you're being seen with your eyes closed, right? And like that's where Dupin
That's
is.
exactly
He's being
exactly
seen.
it.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It is a jumbly way of saying it, but we're also reading Lacan, so what do you expect?
Yeah, I
I
mean,
mean,
you got to parse it
yeah.
5 times, right?
An animal feeding death. Yeah, it's. I like what he's doing here. Part of me just wonders a little bit. Part of me wonders like why he's doing this. I mean, is he trying to break away from? Not necessarily break away from, but is he trying to preempt some archetypal thing or argument where like the hero always exists to resolve the problem? I mean, when we think about like a general story, when there's a hero saves the day, end credits, we are now complete. Everything is whole, right? I wonder if what he's trying to get at is that this story is unique because the quote unquote hero doesn't just kind of like save the day at all. They're just reinvested in this structure, continuing this repetitive theft and concealment of the letter. And in doing so, it just shows that repetitive nature, not kind of a culmination and an end. I mean, I wonder if he's doing this to just kind of show that the hero. I mean, because then when he gets to the end, he says that we all have our own Purloined letters. It's not like we can be a hero and like necessarily overcome it in some grandiose way. I mean, it seems I don't know. It seems to me that he's doing something specific here, but I'm not exactly sure.
Y- Yeah, if I could take a crack at that, and then since I've talked a lot, I'll let other folks. I just want to take a crack at that question before I give the floor back. Yeah, I think what he's kind of saying is it's intersubjectivity, right? So the triad of the symbolic, if I follow Lacan correctly, is how we're going through intersubjectivity here. Um, Now that has connections with the imaginary, right? As he's saying here. So it's not like it's fully independent of something. Um, but in that sense, right, it's not so much a question of like a Jungian archetype, right? Like, is there a hero or isn't there? It's that there's a position in the structure, right? A position for subjectivity that maybe it's
Mm,
heroic, maybe it's not, but it is a feature of the structure that we move, well, that is there for people to move in and out of, right? And the imaginary will kind of, I mean, it basically enables that by kind of preventing, it keeps you seen without, how does he say it? In which
scene.
you are seen, but you are not seen, right? You don't see yourself in the symbolic, so to speak, right? I know it's the imaginary, but you don't see yourself in the symbolic, but the symbolic sees you, right? The inner subjectivity grasps you by virtue of the position.
Oh, I
in
see.
the symbolic.
And then the imaginary identification where you are like, hey, I am seeing that I am not seeing, or whatever. That is sort of what we can tell ourselves to pretend that we're not being affected by it, when in reality, the subject is always passing through the symbolic.
Yeah, I think the imaginary is, if I remember correctly, it's narration for him as opposed to the dramatics, right? Because he's got this relationship between the two that he's relying on heavily. Um, but yeah, as promised, I'll give somebody else a crack.
Thank you, Jack, for commenting. I think we got a lot of stuff here
No
in
need
the.
to thank me. I don't even work here.
Fair enough. We have a few things coming in here in the chat, which are kind of interesting. Shakespeare writes, sorry, this was about like 5-6 minutes ago. Yeah, especially since minister derives from the Latin meaning servant or attendant, or to furnish means of. He's doing what he's supposed to be doing per his title, so he's part of the general structure. I mean, yes. I mean, um, I do. Yes, I think the minister is part of the general structure. I mean, and as Lacan has said previously, the minister has obviously close ties here with the queen and the king, so he's part of the structure generally. And it's interesting that he's so closely related to these individuals, at the same time is willing to kind of stab them in the back by stealing the letter. So it's kind of interesting. Then Homomorphism wrote, I found where we are in the original, but I don't find the word inquisitor or something close to the French Inquisition, which they used to name those events, but also the translation of my copy. Yeah, I know this translation that I have is from like I'm forgetting the exact website, but it's some Lacan we know website that I found it. There's a lot of different translations of it. I heard the Fink one is pretty good as well. Yeah, he might not even say inquisitive in the French. This could also just be the the translation that we have right here. So, but I still think it's fun though to kind of try and make different connections, right? I mean, Lacan would still be proud of us regardless. Okay, not that I need his validation, but we're gonna continue. I'm gonna read actually the next few just because each of them are kind of like one sentence, and then we can go through them. Okay, I'm gonna probably read right up to here. The minister acts as a man who realizes that the police's search is his own defense. Since we are told he allows them total access by his absences, he nonetheless fails to recognize that outside of that search he is no longer defended. This is the very Atrusari whose artisan he was, if we may allow our monster to proliferate, but it cannot be by sheer stupidity that he now comes to be its dupe. For in playing the part of the one who hides, he is obliged to don the role of the queen, and even the attributes of femininity and shadow, so propitious to the act of concealing. Not that we are reducing the hoary. Am I saying that right? Is it? I literally looked this up the other day.
It's hoary. It's like
Hoary, right?
hoarfrost.
Okay. Now that we are reducing the hoary couple of yin and yang to the elementary opposition of dark and light, for its precise use involves what is blinding in a flash of light, no less than the shimmering shadows exploit in order not to lose their prey. Here, sign and being, marvelously asunder, reveal which is victorious when they come into conflict. A man enough to defy to the point of scorn. A lady's fearsome ire undergoes to the point of metamorphosis the curse of the sign he has dispossessed her of. So I'm glad we kind of got through some of this because I feel like some of these sentences are kind of just building on to the previous one, anyways. So let's see here. Where do we want to start? The minister acts as a man who realizes the police's search is his own defense. So it's interesting that the minister really by leaving this letter out in the open and by allowing the police pretty much to say to just come in and search. I mean, that's his defense. I mean, who can you trust more than the person who's showing you everything, right? I mean, that's really what the minister is. He's trying to come off as. So it appears as though, he has nothing to hide. By his total absence, he has nothing to hide. However, Lacan does say he nonetheless fails to recognize that outside of the search, he's no longer defended, meaning that when the search is over, the minister becomes vulnerable. He still has the letter. They know that he still has the letter. So clearly, there's some symbolic significance here to when the search ends and the absence or lack of the search. I don't know if there's anything more to grasp from that. I mean, I don't. Does anyone have an idea like why might the search or the absence of the search mean that he's more vulnerable? If anything, when the search is over, the police are like, well, we did everything we could. He doesn't have the letter. Like, it would appear as though he's, not as vulnerable, but it looks like Lacan is very much saying that he's vulnerable.
I think it's because of the, and I'm going to sound like a broken record. I think it's because of the structure. So like this last part of that previous paragraph is really, I think, telling precisely what does the imaginary keep you from seeing, so to speak, right? The symbolic situation. So we're talking about the symbolic, which he himself was so well able to see. So notice that in a sense, like prior to a movement in the triad, you're able to see the symbolic in a sense, right? But the imaginary can stop you from seeing it, right? By reversing it. In that sense, right? Precisely the symbolic situation which he himself was so well able to see, and in which he is now seeing himself not being seen.
Hmm.
The minister is absent, right? So during the search, I'm going to try and parse this together because the English syntax is challenging, but he was so well able to see the symbolic, right? And then he is now seeing himself not being seen, right? In his absence, right? If I follow Lacan, it's doing two things. On one hand, the absence is kind of this plain dead
Mm.
at an imaginary level. On the other hand, at a symbolic level, um, it's him participating, right?
Hmm.
So the search plays two different roles within the subjectivity, right? By searching the home, there's the absence and there's a participation, right? There is this part of um, the symbolic played out. At the same time, it's not like the conditions have changed. There's still this aspect of searching that needs to happen. So the search keeps him defended, but without the search, he is without defense, right? Kind of inside outside, if you want to think of it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because when does he get found out? When Dupin joins and fulfills the new role of the search, not under his, supervision, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
Not through the official channels.
Well, and whether or not it's through the channels, that's the trick, is that it moves to the next people, right? The repetition changes changes your position in the triad, right? It's, if you want to think of it this way, it's
Ah,
kind of
yeah,
the same
okay.
roles, dramatically speaking, but different people are occupying those roles, even if the roles themselves are the same roles, right? The thief is the thief. It doesn't matter who's playing him for the sake of the symbolic, right? But it does matter in a sense for the imaginary and for like the progression, because the repetition has taken place. But yeah, exactly.
And I like what both of you just said here. I think, especially if we can just build off of the last thing you said here, Jack, it's like, I think that's why it's this intersubjectivity that he stresses so much throughout the piece. It's that, we can definitely focus on the queen or we can focus on the minister or the king. The reality is, I think the role is very important. That's why it's this intersubjective modulus. That's why it's not just a subject that's divorced from everything else. It's in a way a group subject through what he's discussing, at least with his intersubjectivity stuff. And I think, like you said, it doesn't matter who you are. The thief is the thief, right? You steal the letter, you're the thief. That's the repetition at work here. And yeah, and then with what August said, I think that when Dupin enters, it does change things. It still repeats the structure though, right? But that doesn't mean each character is unaffected, right? Or stays the exact same. The next thing here, homomorphism. If I would love for you to comment on. You comment on the word atrucherie or something. Would you mind explaining?
Oh yeah, I just put that in the chat, but it seems to me like just a misspelling, which is kind of funny. But Lacan does actually write it that way. But if you look for the word online, the reference for it is literally just the seminar. So I think it's just a misspelling. If you take out the second U, then you get Autricherie, which sounds to me like you're saying like things that Austrian people do. And if you take out the first I, you get Autricherie, which is like raising ostriches.
Well, I don't know if he's saying Austrianism. I think he's probably saying ostricism. So I'm glad you pointed that out.
But he
so
does spell it this way, which is
say that. Yeah, so he himself spells it like that.
Yeah.
Well, it's brilliant, brilliant. Okay. Let's let's see. Is there anything we want to take from here? If we may allow our monster to proliferate. Well, and also let's focus then. I mean, if it says this is the very ostracisms whose artisan he was. Because I think even in my notes I wrote ostrich. Yeah, I did, but I didn't understand the purpose here. I mean, so you see in my notes I just wrote that Autricherie closely resembles the French word, autriche, which means ostrich. That's kind of like literally what I wrote. From my understanding, I think what Lacan is saying is that the very other isms, or the view that other isms or ostracisms, the view that the minister creates for himself is kind of a fake one in a way. It's almost like he's playing this artistic role to paint himself as an innocent, vulnerable person, right? Like, look, you can search my premises. I have nothing to hide. However, that very process became his downfall. The fact that he painted himself in this manner and crafted this illusion that he was some innocent individual, trying to close himself off from what we were talking about, like being seen, right? That is very much like an ostrich putting their head in the sand, or or an other that's always present regardless of how much you try to run away from it. So that's kind of what I view it as. I mean, when I see monster, I guess I think of the letter or the situation writ large. So that's kind of interesting. And then here, this is where it gets a little weird for me, because further on, Lacan does talk about femininity of the letter, and he doesn't kind of explain a ton. So I would definitely love if someone can help here. But by playing the part of the one who hides, he dons the role of the queen. So clearly, the minister is hiding. Even though he's being transparent, he's still hiding, right? That's the search becomes his defense. Then it says he's obliged to don the role of the queen. And I guess what the queen did is she also tried to hide, right? Like, she put the letter on the table, and by putting the letter out in the open, thinking like no one's gonna. Well, clearly that, he's taking that role, but I don't understand why it's the attributes of femininity and shadow. Like, is there something about shadows that are seductive, maybe, or like I'm not fully sure what Lacan is getting at there.
I think it's these are his words, not mine. I think it's explained when he says, "A man man enough to defy to the point of scorn a lady's fearsome ire." So it's the one of the things he says, right, is it's ire, it's anger, but not just anger. Anger you should fear. It's terrifying anger. Scorn would be another way to think of it, although that might be too far. But
So well, let's build on here. So a man enough to defy to the point. But I mean, to be honest, isn't he doing that though? Like, isn't he like the fact that he's willing, or is it the fact that he knows that she can't make it public, so he's not willing to suffer the wrath of her? Like he
well,
knows that the queen can't say, "Everyone, he stole something from me. Go after him." Right? He can't defy to that point because she can't tell the contents of the letter. So is it that,
well,
it's
yes and no,
feminine?
right? She does. Here's the funny thing about the story, right? Like the minister, or not the minister, the police prefect does know all of this, right? Which she really, a good secret keeper probably wouldn't let this out, right? This is way more information than the constable should have, if it is that damning. Um, so it's a bit of the irony of the story in a way that he knows as much as he knows. But taking a step back from that, notice how the feminine is a place here, right? It's part of the symbolic triad. So
Mm,
um,
true.
the minister takes on femininity by being in this position. The feminine here is like it's not even indignation, right? It's really just
I
anger.
mean I mean, anger, but is it also just that vulnerability? Like the fact that the letter's in the open and the fact that the queen was just, vulnerable. I mean, it also seems like he's saying that in a way.
I I think it's important to see the vulnerability with respect to like it's shared in the inner subjectivity, right? Kind of like with the act of being duped by Dupin, but in general, right? It's not by your stupidity you're duped. It's part of the structure, right? The dramatics of it requires a trick in this
Mm.
structure, right? That doesn't necessarily mean all structures, but
No, I like that. I like that. I guess maybe what I'm doing is I'm focusing too much on a character rather than the general trait in this intersubjective triad.
well, no, I think the vulnerability is a fair point, but I think it's to contextualize it within the triad, right? Because um, all of them, I think I agree with you. The subjective is vulnerable, but it's a vulnerability in the sense of how how the triad gives um, grounds for it, right? You're vulnerable to being tricked. You're vulnerable to concealing a damning secret, right? You will be trespassed of that secret, right?
Mhm.
But you will also do the trespassing, right? That's kind of the trick to it. Is there's a sense of both by virtue of the different position you may find yourself in.
Well, I like what you're saying, and I think towards the end of what you're saying, it gets a little tricky, because when you go
Yeah,
so far one way, it's almost like you're mirroring something else. Have you heard of like a horseshoe theory in political science?
I
It's
have
like
actually.
you go so far
But
left.
where's the hand grenades now? Where are the hand
You
grenades?
you go so far left, it's like you're on the right, right? If you go so far right, it's like you're on the left, right? Like that's the idea. Well, when he gets to this yin and yang thing, he says not that we are reducing the couple of yin and yang to the elementary opposition of light and dark. So he's saying we're not going to reduce femininity to X, masculinity to Y, like in a very strict fashion, because he very much says what happens if light is so bright you become blind and you can't see, right? Or if things are so dark and the shadows, I'm thinking of like a spotlight on an individual. The shadows make the spotlight so much more present, or so much so much brighter. So it's interesting that even though he's taking on this role of femininity, the attributes of it, it doesn't. I don't think Lacan is trying to say that he's reduced to that, and that femininity, in some ways, also can be this. Can also maybe take on some traits of masculinity in a way. Not to. I don't know. I think that's the most I can get from that.
Yeah. I mean, with yin and yang, right? Like dark and light, but each one has a gender, right? So like, he's saying it's an icy dyad, right? It's a stilling, or a kind of limiting duality there. So yeah, I agree with you, because in a sense, right? Like it's two instead of three in a sense, right? So it's not the structure he wants. Because I think, to your point, sign and being reveal what
Right.
is
I mean,
victorious when they come into conflict.
is this symbolic and real here? Sign and being.
Um, I think it's imaginary, and I don't know where he locates the real, if I'm being real with you. Like, he's focused on the symbolic and imaginary here, so it would be surprising if he brought the real in, because usually there's not much to say about it, right? Because
I guess that's
that's the
fair. I
imagine.
mean, well, it's interesting because he says sign and then he says being though, so it might be just like symbolic subjectivity. Oh my gosh, my cat
No,
opened my door. Hold on 1 second.
yeah, no. I mean, you could be right though, because uh, it could be how being is affected by the sign, right? It could also be how the symbolic is affected by the sign. I'm not sure there. Um,
I think that's fair. I mean, I don't know. I mean, but when he says marvelously asunder, it's almost like
yes.
is that when we say that these things are in conflict or separated from each other in a way? Like separated? Asunder, let me.
Yeah, it's like when it's torn, right? Torn apart.
Yeah, divided, torn apart. So yeah, when
Uh,
these things are divided, it says we see which one comes in, which one becomes victorious. And I think for Lacan, is that going to be that's going to be the sign itself, right? Like that's what structures um being, right?
Depends. But
Well, I mean, it says here sign and being when they come, when they get torn apart, it reveals which is victorious. And I think like, I mean, it's interesting. Everything before this is like it's nuanced. We can't reduce them. Like there's like a reliance on one another, like, intersubjectivity. But here, it's almost like he's prioritizing one of the things.
yeah, I mean, the last part of the second sentence definitely speaks to what you're saying, right? The curse of the sign he has dispossessed her of. Um, at the same time, the reason I say it depends is I wonder if he's focusing on, like, is that a point about this? I mean, it's always going to be both with Lacan here, right? But to what degree are we speaking of the symbolic and imaginary here, right? But I saw homomorphism wants to add something too, so I'll give it back to Joel.
oh, it's not really important, but you're right that like asunder is kind of like torn apart, but he uses the word disjoint, so you can kind of assume he means like disjoint in that way. So maybe not like torn apart in the sense that they were ever together, but that they're fundamentally disjoint.
Mm. Interesting. Interesting. I do think that gives it a little bit of a different context for sure. I mean, yeah, for sure. I mean, because like what always has been calling back to me throughout this is, passing through the symbolic. It's like this a state of, remember, it's like the letter being departed. It's this travel, it's this path. Um, so I look at that path and then I look at the subject themselves in a way. And I think Lacan is not that's why I like what you're saying. It's not that necessarily divided because you can't have the subject without the symbolic for Lacan. So it's not that they're divided, but there's almost like this disjoint because as we've been seeing, Dupin might try and remove himself from it, right? The minister might try to remove himself from the triad or whatever. And when we see that separation, quote unquote, that separation or the artificial one, when they come into conflict, we do also see the importance of the sign and how, even though it looks like they've left, that's still just another sign embedded within the triad, right? It's like it's another sign. Or I guess, Jack, I think you did mention like imaginary identification too when we first kind of discussed this as well. So there's a lot going on here. But yeah, I like that comment.
Yeah, it's still kind of that point about chain and like S1. If I could ask someone to shoot a copy of the PDF in the chat, while we're reading on, I wanted to check at the beginning what he says. Correct me if I'm wrong, Noah, or anyone, because I think he opens up by saying he wants to say that there's a sign that acts as like S1 for the chain and does the distribution, and I get the sense that's coming up here, but it's been a while since I looked at it.
We've been doing this for about 6 weeks or 7 weeks. So if it's one of the first readings, I think that he does mention it. Yes, I'm just forgetting where. But let me send you the PDF right now.
Thank you, my man.
Yes, of course. Let's see.
I'll locate the quote as we keep going.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, there's a lot going on here.
Yeah.
This is a great.
Yes,
I mean, this piece. I love this piece, though. I do. Oh, I just found it. This is the seminar we're reading. This is from Jack. I just threw it in the chat. With that being said, though, let's continue. I want to continue. Let's just finish page 7, and then when we get to the top of page 8 here, we'll talk about it, and then we can go from there. So, for this sign is indeed that of a woman, insofar as she invests her very being therein, founding it outside the law, which subsumes her, nevertheless, originarily, in a position of signifier, nay, of fetish. In order to be worthy of the power of that sign, she has but to remain immobile in its shadow, thus finding, moreover, like the queen, that simulation of mastery in inactivity that the minister's lynx eye alone was able to penetrate. This stolen sign, here, then, is man in its possession. Sinister, and that such possession may be sustained only through the honor it defies. Cursed in calling him who sustains it to punishment or crime, each of which shatters his vassalage to the law. There must be in this sign a singular noli me tangere for its possession. Like the Socratic stingray, to benumb its man to the point of making him fall into what appears clearly in his case to be a state of idleness. And the final sentence here, for noting as the narrator does as early as the first dialogue, that with the letter's use its power disappears, we perceive that this remark, strictly speaking, concerns precisely its use for ends of power, and at the same time that such a use is obligatory for the minister. Now, we are finally getting here to page 8. There's a lot to be said here, but I think the first 2 paragraphs are quite, I mean, honestly, I think all of these relate, which is, again, I'm happy that we're doing this. I mean, the longer paragraphs, I like to just read and then talk about that, but some of these shorter sentences, it makes sense to kind of read as a bit of a group, so grouping all of them. So when we start with this first little section here, we see that the sign is the figure of a woman. It is this idea of womanness invested into the sign. And I think when we say this, I think we're talking a lot about the letter. I think we're talking about how the letter transforms, the individual. I mean, right before this, we see that there's a metamorphosis in that little section right before that we were just talking about, that this curse of the sign transforms the subject. It changes the subject. So a lot of this changes the subject into that of a woman. And because the queen did all of whatever secrecy that she's hiding outside the law, right? She can't tell the king. That's why she's afraid. She doesn't want the king to find out. We find that this womanness or this femininity to the sign is what was crafted or was produced outside the law. And in doing so, the woman becomes the woman, at least as a sign here, becomes subsumed to this fetish. And when we say fetish here, I think what Lacan is saying is just an object of desire here. So now this letter is akin to this femininity, this womanness, something to be desired. That's kind of what I take from that first little section here. And then from there, Jack, I see your comment. We'll get to that in just a second. From there, we talk about the minister's lynx eye. So we see that the sign has so much power that she remains immobile in its shadow. She can't really bring attention to the fact that the letter is there. So she's in the shadow of the letter. She can't do anything because she doesn't want to, make the king notice. So by her being inactive or immobile, that is a way of the queen maintaining power. I mean, it says here, the queen, that simulation of mastery. Wait, no, that says it's for the minister. But at the same time, I still think that the queen having some level of power through her inactivity. However, the queen is overall powerless in general. I mean, that's why she remains immobile. And that's why the minister's lynx eye was able to kind of take advantage of her powerlessness. I mean, it's weird. I don't want to call her fully powerless, but I think that's getting at. I mean, I think that, there is some power she has because, she tries to conceal it, but at the same time, she can't bring attention to it. So I don't know, that idea of power may be thinking too much. But overall, she remains immobile, and the minister penetrates this immobility. Okay, with that being said, Jack, I noticed you posted something. You posted kind of a lot here. Anything of particular importance?
Yeah, a couple things that'll, I think, help here. So yeah, I didn't see anything about S1. He's just doing the signifying chain here. And basically what he says, right, is that what he's interested in with this seminar is how imaginary incidences, rather than it's representing our experience, reveal what remains inconsistent unless they are related to the symbolic chain which binds and orients them. So, I mean, you're kind of getting that here. So, yeah, the signifier, like we were talking about earlier, I usually associate with the imaginary, but here it's the symbolic. So, like that, the female sign here, the signs he's talking about, right? He's saying that the chain is what stops the inconsistency between um, the imaginary and experience, right? So something more conscious.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, when we're thinking about this point about intersubjectivity, right? That's the subjectivity he's kind of interested in, is the subjectivity that prevents that, well, that contributes and yet kind of also insulates that inconsistency. So when we're thinking of that asunder point, right? And to your point, Noah, maybe he is talking about the real. I'm not certain there, but at least in this context, right? He is noticing the inconsistency again and the way the chain plays two roles, right? It kind of defends against it being a problem, but it also enables it, right?
And it's almost contradictory in a way. But is it out of that? Is it out of that tension, right? It's almost like there's some tension, but out of that is what drives the repetition. No? Like the displacement of the signifier. I mean, I don't know. That's just kind of what I took from what you're saying, but I feel like what you're saying is more nuanced.
Maybe, but I think that's a fair point, right? Because the repetition is so let me add just a little bit more to this from the beginning. Um, the importance of these imaginary impregnations in the partializations of the symbolic alternative, which give the symbolic chain its appearance, right? So if we're bringing this all together, right, the imaginary impregnates the symbolic chain, right, at least with its appearance. So we're getting that sense of like the queen being the face of the thief temporarily, right?
Hmm.
Um, or the way that femininity is getting a face
Yeah,
here,
I
right?
think that's
It,
that's the move. Yeah, it's like how yeah, because that was the reading that you were there. I think it was one of the first readings. The imaginary impregnates the symbolic, right? And like we were talking about, no pun intended there, right? But it is a very intimate relationship, right?
exactly.
And the face, and that's why these characters are fascinating. That there's always this face to it, but deep down, there's this intersubjectivity that's passing through the symbolic, and we can assign a face to whatever. But I mean, the reality is, I think what Lacan is getting at is beneath that surface, all of them are interrelated.
Right. And that face, the imaginary impregnates that face, right? The imaginary gives that face to the symbolic in a sense, right? So, like, again, we're not conscious of this, is kind of his point, right? It's the queen doesn't necessarily intend for her femininity to be the femininity of which the chain finds itself impregnated by, right? It's not necessarily a sign she wants to consciously invest with it, but it happens,
But
right?
it happens, yeah. And if we can just follow along from that, there's that feminine side, but then look what Lacan says. This stolen sign here is man in its possession. So I'm wondering, is he saying that the minister? I mean, it's weird because he it seems like he's describing the act of theft as on the side of man and the concealment of the letter on the side of woman. But ironically, when one steals the letter, they now hold it, putting them in the sign of woman, right?
Mm. Yeah, I kind of took it like when you steal the letter, you're taking the sign of man.
But
Like
but
you're
but
possessing
then
man by
that's the
taking
thing.
the letter.
But the ministers did steal the letter, and Lacan writes that the minister
Right,
is has been attributed to femininity.
right. So when he hides the letter, he's like you're saying, right? He's participating with a sign of femininity. When he takes the letter, he's taking a sign of masculinity. I think we're getting at the same thing,
I
but
think
I think
so.
we might.
Yeah, I think so. It's weird. I mean, we can keep following along with this. I mean, Lacan calls this possession sinister. It's that like there's this lack of honor, like he has defied the law. Like all of this. And it's weird that maybe he's saying that man is on that side of things. So it's uh, a little bit more like a lack of honor. But in a way, it's kind of weird too that the queen also through the fact that she has to conceal it from the king, there's also a lack of too. I mean, and maybe this just keeps going to show that no matter how much we try to divide the yang, the masculine and the feminine, the theft or concealment of the letter, there is some interrelated component there to them.
Well, yeah. Let me add this too, right? What Lacan says is that the appearance from the symbolic, or the appearance the imaginary provides the symbolic, is specific to the law of the chain governing the psychoanalytic effects that are decisive for closure, repression, denial, and so forth, right? And these effects follow the displacement of the signifier, which is what it's exactly what you and I were just talking about, right? The displacement of the signifier, that imaginary factors figure only as shadows and reflections in the process. What interests us today is the manner in which subjects relate each other and their displacement during the intersubjective repetition, right?
Mhm.
So it's the way that foreclosure is kind of shared through the symbolic um, by displacing the signifier, right? I'll, I'll add one more just for the sake of time. We
Okay.
shall see that this displacement is determined by the place which a pure signifier, the Purloined Letter, comes to occupy in their trio, and this is what will confirm for us its status as repetition automatism, meaning you know
Right.
uh, it's automatic repetition,
Right.
right?
And
It
that's and
produces
that's
itself passively.
and that's the first time he presents that little thesis, right? Like that's the first time. It's just like this is what defines it, and it's that it's an automatic thing, and that's why these and just so we can continue here, Jack. I mean, that's why the theft and concealment, the attributes of femininity and masculinity, it's almost like they're automatic too, right? I mean, it's not like the minister is um, dressing up, in a particularly feminine manner on purpose. I mean, it just automatically happens. And then when the letter is stolen from the minister, Dupin occupies that, right? It's that automatic thing. So it's interesting. Here, Noli me tangere. I don't know, homomorphism if you want to take that, but I mean, I looked it up. It's touch me not. That's that's what I found. Touch me not. So what Lacan is saying here, I think what he's saying is he's implying two things. There must be in the sign a touch me not for its possession. So I see two things. I see that maybe the letter shouldn't be touched, and that if it is touched, um, the person who touches it is cursed in a way. They are now burdened with these attributes. These, in a way, these identifications are coded upon them, or they exist within the letter shadow now. They are fundamentally implicated by the letter. And Lacan makes this akin to the Socratic stingray, and that is going to be how in Plato's Republic, or as we know with Socrates, with the Socratic method, Socrates is always asking questions over and over and over again, and the people, or like the interlocutors in the Republic, um, I'm forgetting like Cephalus or Pontalus or what some of those guys, they all kind of become Thrasymachus. They become numb to the point of making themselves kind of fall into the state of idleness. It's like, I mean that's what I wrote. So it's like whoever occupies the letter in a way becomes immobilized in the same way that people who had to sit through all of Socrates' questioning became immobilized because of how brilliant he was. Now, in a way, that state of idleness, we see it happening with the queen. We see it happening with the minister, right? They just kind of put the letter out in the open. They're kind of immobilized. I mean, maybe we see it with Dupont, right? Like I mean, in a way, maybe we see it with the reader. I mean, the letter is right in front of us the whole time. Literally, as the prefect of police is describing the search, the letter's in front of us. As the prefect of police is describing the queen and that process, the letters. At the very end of the story, the readers are like shocked, because the letter was right in front of us. So in a way, whoever occupies this letter or the sign, I don't know, they become numb to it in a way. I mean, I was just thinking about. I try to relate it sometimes back to the reader. Lacan towards the end is going to be relating all of this kind of how it relates to us as people because we are the ones reading this and understand it. So I don't know. It's interesting that he notes this state of idleness, and then ultimately with what we just ended on, he brings in the narrator. So he says, as the narrator does as early as the first dialogue, we perceive the remark that discusses it looks like how it says the ends of power. Um, so to me, it maybe seems like Lacan is how the holding of the letter is what allows there to be power given to individuals, but the second the letter is exposed, they don't have power anymore. So that's what I read it as, is that there needs to be the secret upheld. Otherwise, the letter would lose any and all influence. So yes. Okay. That should be good. Now we are on page 8. Whoop, whoop. Out of 10. Let's do it. We have 20-ish minutes left. To be unable to rid himself of it, the minister indeed must not know what else to do with the letter, for that use places him in so total a dependence on the letter as such that in the long run it no longer involves the letter at all. We mean that for the use truly to involve the letter, the minister, who after all would be so authorized by his service to his master the king, might present to the queen respectful admonitions, even were he to assure their sequel by appropriate precautions, or initiate an action against the author of the letter, concerning whom the fact that he remains outside the story's focus reveals the extent to which it is not guilt and blame which are in question here, but rather that sign of contradiction and scandal constituted by the letter, in the sense in which the gospel says that it must come regardless of the anguish of whoever serves as its bearer, or even submit the letter as document in a dossier to a third person qualified to know whether it will issue in a star chamber for the queen or minister's disgrace. Let's get this last sentence here. We will not know why the minister does not resort to any uses, and it is fitting that we don't, since the effect of this non-use alone concerns us. It suffices for us to know that the way in which the letter was acquired would pose no obstacle to any of them. So it is very clear that the minister cannot rid himself of the letter. Thus, he has become dependent on the letter. There's a total dependence on the letter. And then Lacan says, in the long run, it no longer involves at all. So the fact of the matter is that the minister is not able to share the contents of the letter. All on through the fact that, he's holding on to it, he becomes dependent upon the letter, or at least the subjectivity of the minister becomes dependent on it. Now, Lacan then asks this question. Is it even a question? I mean, it's just like a long sentence that why is the minister, who has great standing ties with the king and queen, why is he not using his authority to protect the queen? Why is he not giving the queen advice? Why is he not making it his personal vendetta to go after who has screwed over the queen? So he doesn't take any action. It is very clear that in the story, we don't really know who authored the letter itself. So there's really no guilt and blame we can place upon anyone. So the story is focused on the fact that it's just a scandal. It's just purely, it's a scandal. So it's unfortunate on one hand that the minister doesn't do anything. But clearly the emphasis of the story is the fact that it is a scandal. And Lacan says, in the sense in which the gospel says ... And when he makes this reference to the gospel, he is suggesting, and this is what I wrote, that some events are inevitable. Meaning that maybe just the way things go, the way the dominoes fall, is that the minister is stuck with this letter and he's stuck with no way out. He's stuck. So, there's that. And then, Lacan also says he could submit the letter as a document and a dossier to a third person, meaning that he could just kind of have the letter and submit it to give it to a third party, which could lead to a star chamber, which just means an investigation. I guess it's like some historical thing. I think it's like English court. So, the queen could go to court maybe, or he himself could just steal the letter and just be like, you know what, I'm going to take the downfall here. I'm going to take the L. I stole the letter. I deserve to kind of be punished, right? Like all of these things are possibilities. However, he doesn't resort to any of these. And Lacan writes that it is fitting that we don't know why the minister didn't do anything. Because our focus of the story or our focus of analysis is going to be, why does the minister choose not to take action? So that's kind of what I took from this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
to kind of build off of that, I think what's really interesting here is that he adds, in a way, he says we don't. To your point, Riley, we don't know, but at the same time, he says that in a way, what's fitting about why we don't know is that it shows us that the story isn't concerned with guilt and blame, which does kind of make sense to me in some ways because, I mean, I believe it's the queen's kind of she's kind of wronged the king here, or at least that's what the letter would reveal. But Lacan basically says, right, like the story is not about the blame she would take. It's not about the guilt she has. It's about the sign of contradiction and the scandal itself that the letter constitutes. Which I think the sign of contradiction is in the sense that, I mean, as long as the letter isn't read, the scandal doesn't come out, right? But the scandal is still constituted,
Hmm.
right? So the letter is a sign, right? Like a kind of physical word, if you like, that keeps that duality, right? The scandal has not been discovered, but the scandal is discoverable. People have discovered the scandal, but much like the letter, they're quiet about it, except among Dupin and others, right? It becomes like gossip.
Yeah, it's
Because I think,
interesting. There's so many contradictory elements. Like, the queen doesn't want the information to get out, yet if there's a whole team of police searching for it, right, who will probably read the letter, or like the best place to hide something is out in the open, right? It's like there are so many kind of, or even like Dupin trying to act as a hero, and then towards the end of the story, he's like, you know what, I'm gonna get my money in my bag, like we see so many contradictions here, and you're right, we don't know, yet this scandal still occurs. So I think pointing out that it's not about guilt and blame is smart for Lacan here, because we're not going to make this about, an emotive reaction, right? Or anything like that. It's just more about the automatic reaction. Well, I mean, I guess sometimes emotions can be automatic. I'm sure that the queen feels stressed, right? And angry. I mean, he says ire, right? So there are those, but I think he's not making it about judgment. Maybe that's what it is. The story's not about judgment, but rather about the automatic reactions.
well, it, I think he says it's about the anguish, right? So to your earlier point on power, right? In a way, what he's saying is the power of possessing the letter is its impotence, right? It is benumbing. It is, um, it deep. The funny thing is, right? It kind of depotentializes you. So by having the letter, you find yourself less able to do things in a sense. Because I
Mm,
think
mhm, like a
this
mobile.
gospel thing, yes, the letter immobilizes you precisely. It's only by different places in the triad that you're able to do things like create a search, right? Like be indignified.
Yeah, you move through the triad, right? You're moving through the symbolic while simultaneously staying immobile when you have the
Right,
letter.
right, because in a sense, by taking the letter and possessing the manliness, he's in a sense also suggesting you take on impotency, right? Which is classic psychoanalysis. Um, to have the phallus is to be unable to use the
Right.
phallus, right? It's classic. But I want to add one more thing to that, right? Because what he's kind of doing is he's giving a sideways look to the aulic, right? To the courtly. He says it's not so much about the star chamber, right? It's about the anguish of being the bearer of the third person to issue the letter in the star chamber, right? By having it, the impotency is also related to the potency of the anguish of having it to serve
Mhm.
as its bearer. right? By having the letter, you can do that. But it's so anguishing to be able to do that, you're um, immobilized, right? The potency depotentializes the other action, the action itself.
Hmm. Dang, good catch. Good catch. I'm just like, I'm not like, I'm
Thank
like,
you.
you know what, you lead it. Like,
Take that,
I
Sunday
love
school.
it. This is great. You know, like this is
Oh no,
amazing.
I'm good. I've done it
No, I mean,
myself.
this is really good. I think like yes, I feel like you're pointing out things that I'm kind of like not catching. So I'm just gonna make a quick note here. Sorry, Jack, one
Just
sec. Yeah, I
I'm just
mean,
trying to
yeah,
build off
this is
of it.
good stuff. This is good stuff. I wanna let's see. We're running out a little bit out of time. I wanna see where we could end here. Maybe I don't know, 15 minutes. Want to just let's try our best if we can to just speed through the next three. I wanted to just try and get this reading done in the next two, meaning this week and next week, because I do want to move on. So let's try our best to continue. And if we can't, obviously we can also, do an extra reading. I'm not too pressed about it. But let's do it, okay? For it is clear that if the use of the letter, independent of its meaning, is obligatory for the minister, its use for ends of power can only be potential, since it cannot become actual without vanishing in the process. But in that case, the letter exists as a means of power only through the final assignations of the pure signifier. Did I say that right here? Just want to make
That's fine.
okay.
Assignations.
Assignations, right? Because I thought it's maybe assignations, not assignations, right? Assignations.
But then it sounds like you're saying ass.
I know, so it gets a little
I'm
weird.
sorry. I couldn't
Of
resist. Go ahead, homomorphism.
of of the pure signifier, namely, by prolonging its diversion, making it reach whomever it may concern through a supplementary transfer. That is, by an additional act of treason whose effects the letter's gravity makes it difficult to predict, or indeed by destroying the letter, the only sure means, as Dupont divulges at the start, of being rid of what is destined by nature to signify the annulment of what it signifies. Okay, so another quite long sentence here. Can you believe that? That's a single sentence. So Lacan begins by talking about how the minister is obligated to use the letter, but only symbolically, right? Like the minister is not necessarily obligated to have the contents of the letter spilled out or made public, but only symbolically, because if the letter were to be put to use, then the power would disappear, and that's kind of what we were talking about just previously. Now, when Lacan is talking about the final assignations of the pure signifier, he is talking about how the letter is diverted from the path, like we've kind of discussed before, or how there's some level of displacement here, and other individuals um, allow the symbolic power of the letter to be kept alive. I mean, part of me wonders, what if only the minister had it? Like, would the scandal just go on, infinitely, right? Or is the fact that the letter is changing hands and going, moving from person to person, is that kind of what gives the letter, some power, or that allows its dimension in a way to be kept alive? Now, it does seem here, it says like by prolonging its diversion, um, it's an act of treason whose effects of the letter's gravity makes it difficult to exist. So, I mean, it does say I mean, I think that all of this is just saying a little bit of like a summary. Has the letter will have some kind of unpredictable consequence. There are unpredictable consequences for whoever has it. And if the letter were destroyed, there would be no signification at all. So again, this paragraph to me just seems like a summary almost. Like I don't know if I mean, yeah, I don't even think that I need to highlight anything for myself there. the next paragraph. The ascendancy which the minister derives from the situation is of the letter, but whether he knows it or not, of the role it constitutes for him. And the prefixed remarks indeed present him as someone who dares all things, which is commented upon significantly, those unbecoming as well as those becoming a man. Words whose pungency escapes Baudelaire when he translates this sentence. The sentence is those unbecoming a man as well as those becoming him. For in its original form, the appraisal is far from appropriate to what might concern a woman. Kind of interesting here. So Lacan starts with how, again, the minister ascends to some higher status, not due to the function of the letter, but the possession of the letter giving him some authority. But it's interesting here when Lacan talks about Baudelaire, because in a way, Lacan is kind of dogged on Baudelaire throughout this piece about his translation. So we'll see how Baudelaire's translation here loses some of the context. So it looks like, and I try to look this up, and I do have it kind of written down that like I'm not sure exactly where Baudelaire makes a mistake here. I mean, yeah, it's very clear that the prefect is depicted as some kind of arrogant dude. We understand that. And we also understand that his moral character is, a bit ambiguous. I mean, he wants to help the queen, right? That's his duty, that's his order, but he's also talking about, right? So he engages in actions that are both worthy and unworthy, or both becoming and unbecoming of a man. Meaning that, he's doing kind of, on one hand, he's doing something honorable, on the other hand, he's not. Now, here is where Lacan says Baudelaire translates something a little incorrectly. I don't obviously read this, read the language, right? I don't speak French, but I also just don't understand why Baudelaire is making a mistake. I mean, it appears that maybe Baudelaire is not as forward about it. I'm not really sure. I mean, Lacan is just concerned with this in English and how the pungency escapes the translation. Like maybe, I mean that's all I got, is that it just maybe it doesn't highlight the prefix moral status as much as it does in English. I mean, I don't know, homomorphism, if you see anything there. Yeah, I don't really.
I don't think it's a mistake. Like, I don't think Lacan's beating up on him as a translator. I think what he's saying though is like if you read it in Baudelaire's French, those unbecoming a man as well as those becoming him. So it keeps it all in the if I'm understanding the French correctly, it keeps it all in the man gender. Whereas Lacan is saying in the English, Lacan reads it as saying that this is appropriate to what the way Poe wrote it in English, Lacan reads as appropriate to what concerns a woman rather than a man. So he's saying that Baudelaire puts it in terms of the man, whereas he reads Poe is putting it in terms of at least what might concern a woman when he says those as unbecoming as well as those becoming a man. Whereas Baudelaire said those unbecoming a man as well as those becoming him. Notice the direct objects are both men.
But why is it not the same here, where it's those becoming as well as those becoming men? Like this is functionally the same as saying those unbecoming as well as men too.
I think it's because without the direct object in the word unbecoming, it's basically saying that the man can unbecome. Whereas I think the
Oh, so
direct
you're
object in the French is kind of
interesting.
keeping it in the sense of the man is unbecoming. Right, like it's
Mhm.
describing a man, whereas I think Lacan's trying to say that um, it's from the standpoint of a woman. There's an unbecoming of a man here. It it's a bit weird, right? And that's why I don't like when people try to like go too deep into like translation differences to make their point. There's probably a better way to make this argument, but that's the way he's trying to do it.
Well, maybe what we could look at then, if we're dealing with like the concept of like a woman, right? Like it says here, the appraisal for Poe's form, the appraisal is far more appropriate to what might concern a woman.
Yeah.
Maybe what we could think about is like the woman in the story, like the queen, for example. Like women historically, we all, I mean, I would hope that we're all aware, have, you know, been judged more, you know, like held to higher standards, a lot more scrutiny. I think, is it that when we look at the prefect, are we kind of, I mean, is Poe's translation trying to take into account, or is what Lacan is saying that,
Oh,
is he talking about maybe aligning the prefect with how women have been judged in the past?
no, I think it's echoing what he said earlier. Remember, the minister becomes woman, right? He become he doesn't become the queen um, per se, but he becomes woman by the feminine mark, right? By the
But
feminine
then,
signifier.
but isn't the, but you have to remember in the story, womanness is, uh, I forget the exact word, but I'll just say this: woman is coded, right, upon the sign or the signifier of the letter, right? So because the queen herself is morally ambiguous, right? Like she's going behind the queen's back, yet she still wants to uphold some legitimacy for the for royalty. I think Lacan might be drawing a parallel between the prefect and the queen here. Neither of them have the letter, but both of them do have morally ambiguous attitudes.
I
Or
don't think
morally,
it's I don't know if it's the attitude though. I think it's the like it's the ire, right? It's the position by having the letter.
hmm,
Like I don't think it's their morality qua morality. I think it's that what does the queen do, right? She's dared something um damning, right? She has taken part in a scandal. What does the minister do, right? He takes hold of that scandal. But in a sense, right, he's now enraptured in his own scandal because now everybody's looking for him.
hmm,
Like it's
interesting. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, this just seems so like nominal to me, but I see what you're saying. I do.
it it is because I think his real point is less about like I said, I think the translation hinges on a direct object usage. But I think what he's really saying is it would be more appropriate to say this of a woman than of a man. I think that's what he's really trying to
True.
say.
Yeah, he's
True.
focusing on how the it seems like he's focusing on how the English version uh puts in the spotlight like emasculation, whereas the French version is maybe more of a abstract, like not upholding honor or not being manly. The English version is directly saying like an emasculation.
Mm. It it's weird though too though, right? Because as much as we can think of emasculation there, if we're saying that it's more appropriate to a woman, what we're saying is that it's a feminization, right? So, and I like your point. I'm just saying, like, I think his, I think the construction of this argument could use a little work.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a little bit more precise.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, I think
Right.
what everyone's saying is right, but I think the general consensus, like, you know, I think what Lacan is doing is not. I mean, he's coming off as being, you know, saying which translation is the best and like, why, Baudelaire is like messing up a little bit on these small. No, he's not explaining it the best, right? But I think overall, yeah, Jack, it's probably about the direct object. Yeah, August, it is very much. I think, in one sense, one's about like emasculation, and the other, I like what you like maybe kind of like manly traits or something along those lines, rather than like the general. I don't want to say like vibe, but the general notion of what constitutes like masculinity and femininity. So I'm picking up what everyone's laying down. I think I think we should be good today. Let me just go through this really quick. So we do have half page of 8, 9, and then 10, and we are donezo. So we are getting through this. So it might be 1 to 2 more left, but this is I think that this is a pretty thorough reading of Lacan's seminar on the Purloined Letter. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to end the recording, and I hope to see everyone next week.